In some cases, it's no surprise that investigators come to a point where they must mark a case as cold, or worse, unsolvable. For these 5 cases, however, investigators were blessed with groundbreaking evidence that ultimately solved the case. From something as small as a strand of cat hair to something as devious as an evil scientist, these pieces of evidence lead to justice. Number 5. Dawn Elaine Sanchez was a 32-year-old working woman that mysteriously vanished on August 30th, 1991. Before she vanished, Dawn was living temporarily in a Four Seasons motel in Los Angeles. On the morning of her disappearance, witnesses reported seeing her enter her boyfriend, Bernardo Base's vehicle. The tan brown 1979 Pontiac Grand Prix would later play a huge role in the investigation. Dawn slipped into the passenger side seat, which security footage confirmed, and the couple drove away together. Dawn was never seen again. At the time, Dawn was working as a street worker, so her disappearance apparently didn't startle anyone in the early stages. However, the fact that she wasn't reported missing until October of that year immediately raised red flags for investigators. It's hard to imagine your significant other being gone for such a long time before you decide to jump into action. From the beginning, this made Bernardo seem suspicious. A quick search was conducted by investigators, who believed they already knew who was responsible. Still, it was hard to build a case with absolutely no evidence. In fact, the Pontiac that the couple drove away in went missing shortly after Bernardo's report. He was apprehended and accused of kidnapping his girlfriend and taking her life. This was mostly, in part, thanks to a witness statement from a man named William Alcorn. He shared with investigators that he tagged along for a ride with Bernardo and Dawn that day. He reported that the couple had been arguing heavily throughout the day. The trio eventually stopped at a softball park, a short drive from their motel. After hanging at the park for a brief moment, the couple began to argue again. Bernardo and Dawn re-entered the vehicle, drove about 100 yards away, and then stopped. It was during this time that William stated he heard yelling followed by a gunshot. William then witnessed Bernardo loading into his vehicle and driving away completely. An evidence collection error occurred and William's video testimony was lost entirely. He refused to share his confessions a second time and requested to not be involved in the case or trial. Bernardo was released due to a lack of evidence, and it seemed that the suspect got away with his heinous crime. However, in 2010, investigators employed the help of a NASA-built robot made to detect certain materials underground. The talented robot managed to find pieces of Bernardo's abandoned car buried in a vacant lot. Once all the pieces were recovered, it was clear that Bernardo tried to destroy evidence. Around the same time this went down, Bernardo's apartment was searched for any signs of Dawn. They couldn't find any physical remains, but found traces of decayed flesh inside a small storage closet, where it was later revealed Bernardo had hidden Dawn's remains. He was tried and sentenced to 6 years for his crime. Number 4. In January of 1988, an unimaginable nightmare began to play out in front of Peggy Carr's very eyes. Peggy lived with her husband, PA, and their 4 children in Alturas, Florida. The family lived a simple life. They kept to themselves, but were also very kind to their neighbors. Witnesses recounted later that the family was a lovely group of people that avoided trouble at all costs. The houses in Peggy's neighborhood were a decent distance from one another. The family's closest neighbors was a couple, George and Diana Trepal. While the Carrs weren't very close to this couple, they'd also never had any serious problems with them in the past. However, George later recalled the local zoning board to rat out PA for building a small apartment space on his property, a task that a permit was required for. The construction was shut down. Despite being frustrated with their neighbors, the Carr family followed the rules and didn't make a fuss. It seemed that there was no fair reason for George to be so angry with the Carr family, but he made his hate known when he placed a letter inside the Carr family mailbox. The letter was a threat that stated if the Carr family didn't move out of Florida, something fatal would happen to them. Most of the Carr family dismissed the letter, thinking it was part of a prank or perhaps a very bad joke. Throughout these hiccups, Peggy was growing more and more concerned with the situation before her. In October of 1988, Peggy was confronted by Diana Trippall, who complained that Peggy's boys were disturbing the neighborhood. The pair got into a heated argument that ended with Diana storming off and turning back occasionally to express threatening phrases, such as "you won't get away with this." It was just a few short days after this encounter that Peggy began experiencing strange symptoms such as chest pain, tingling fingers, high blood pressure, and severe body aches and vomiting. At first, she thought she was having a heart attack. A visit to the hospital dismissed this theory, and Peggy was sent home. Within a matter of days after returning home, 2 of Peggy's children grew very ill with the same issues. Peggy went into a coma abruptly as her children were coming down with the same illness. Unfortunately, she eventually passed away. However, her kids survived. An investigation was opened because certain doctors theorized that Peggy had lost her life due to some kind of poison. This doctor believed that thallium, an illegal form of pesticide, was the source of Peggy's passing. Investigators collected samples from the Carr home to test for residue of thallium. Sure enough, they found significant amounts of the poison in various Coke bottles that had been thrown out. Through witness interviews, the officials were led to the Carr family's neighbor, George Trippall. They found that the then 42-year-old man hosted whodunit parties and frequently mentioned thallium as a weapon. An undercover officer was put in contact with George and began attending these special parties to obtain evidence. The cop actually grew so close to George during this time that when George moved away, he rented his home to the officer. After having the privacy to conduct a full search, a small bottle of thallium was found. It was clear as day that George had poisoned at least 3 members of the Carr family, with one of them obviously having passed away. He was sentenced to the electric chair. Number 3. DNA evidence from a crime scene is usually that of the victim or the suspect, but in this very special and shocking case, the DNA that helped solve the mystery was actually that of a plant. That's right, the DNA and genetic makeup of a tree in the forest led investigators to finally closing a 23-year-old cold case involving a Slade woman. Denise Johnson was never reported missing, so there was no ongoing search for her when her remains were suddenly found in a wooded area in a nearby park in Phoenix, Arizona. Her body was discovered on May 2, 1992, which was later reported to be the day following her attack. When reviewing the case information, there's little to no details as to how Denise was found or what condition she was in. A coroner's report was able to accurately determine the cause of her passing and confirmed that foul play was at work. The poor victim had been viciously attacked and harassed before fading out. When investigating the crime scene, detectives found a major piece of key evidence. Near the dump site, a pager was recovered. It looked relatively new and in decent condition, meaning that the person who dropped it was most likely responsible for the crime. In addition to this evidence, a special witness report claimed to have seen a truck speeding away from the dump site in the early morning hours before the body was discovered. The pager was traced back to an unnamed man that lived in the area. Upon interviewing this man, detectives found that he had a son named Mark Bogan. Interestingly enough, it turned out that Mark drove a truck almost identical to the one that had been described by the witness. When confronted by investigators, Mark shared a colorful story about how he picked up Denise as a random hitchhiker because he was worried about her well-being, though she asked to be let out of the car. Apparently, that's when she sneakily grabbed the pager and ran off with it. Mark also gave police permission to search his vehicle, and when they did, they found tree bark and seeds. There was no evidence strong enough to connect him to the case. With hardly any evidence, only a single witness, and no further information, the case was eventually sealed up and labeled cold. A few years later, it was reopened by a special cold case team that aimed to get new answers. One investigator noticed something while revisiting the crime scene. The tree closest to Denise's body had a large nick in the bark. Luckily, the tree samples from Mark's car were still in evidence storage. The unnamed investigator compared the samples with the help of a genetics professor and researcher. Together, they found that the tree DNA was a match. The tree seeds in Mark's truck were confirmed to have come from the exact same tree. This evidence was enough to place Mark at the dump site of his victim, and he was later tried and sentenced to life in prison. Number 2. David Hitler and David Guy were two casual friends, known by others as Big Dave and Little Dave. The two men had a close relationship in which they commonly helped one another through struggles. Hitler lived a short distance away from Guy's rinky-dink camper. Due to the limited resources encountered while living out of a camper, Guy often sought help from Hitler, who let him shower at his apartment and commonly stayed over for dinner. Outsiders describe the duo as best friends, but there's no sure way of knowing the exact dynamic of their relationship. After all, most people don't take their best friend's life. Due to an estranged and distant family, there was no major crack in the news or heads up to police when Guy suddenly vanished. His neighbors explained that one day he just never came home. They obviously assumed that he was at his friend's apartment for a few days, which wasn't uncommon. However, the sad and gruesome truth was finally revealed. In July of 2012, a few random people stumbled across the horrific sight of Guy's dismembered remains in a shallow grave in South Sea Beach. A coroner was able to determine an exact cause of the passing, but evidence was found that suggested he was attacked with a blunt force object to the head and then separated post-mortem. The exact date of passing was also unclear. The coroner was only able to provide a wide range of time between July 3rd and 30th of 2011, the previous year. The first set of remains had likely been sitting out in plain sight for over a year before they were discovered. Shortly after this first discovery, a group of students strolling the beach in another area found Guy's torso wrapped in a shower curtain and stuffed into a hole. Investigators collected all the evidence they could from the various crime scenes. They had little to no luck in immediately finding a DNA match. Eventually, they were pointed to Hitler's direction. He was hesitant to confess at first, but one investigator was slick enough to snatch a hair sample from Hitler's cat. It later compared the cat hair on the shower curtain and confirmed it to be an exact match. After another round of interrogations, Hitler finally confessed to police what he had done and where the rest of Guy's body could be found. However, investigators are well aware that there's still missing pieces to this case. For example, there's no clear motive explained. While in trial, though, professionals declared that Hitler had a learning disability, a very low IQ, and very serious depression problems. He was still fit to stand trial, but the mystery behind the crime began to fade after prosecutors realized that Hitler wasn't a hateful mastermind. Number 1. This piece of evidence is perhaps one of the most unique samples we've covered. Carla Brown was a beautiful young woman at the start of her life when things tragically changed for her in mid-1978. Carla's family requested a wellness check on their loved one after she had missed several phone calls and couldn't be found by her fiancé. Officers arrived at her home and included the basement in their general property search after Carla failed to answer the door. In the darkness of the damp, gloomy basement, a horrific scene was set up. We can't go into details about what they found, but it's suffice to say that Carla had clearly been attacked, taken advantage of, and then forced to lose her life. Investigators that inspected the scene over the first few days found no signs of forced entry, and although it was clearly an example of foul play, they couldn't find a single trace of evidence to move the case along. Carla was put to rest, and it seemed at first that her case would just be another cold one locked away. However, when reviewing autopsy photos, one detective noticed a sizable bite mark on Carla's shoulder. The indentations were clear and precise thanks to post-mortem processes. A mold was created of the bite, as investigators hoped it would bring them closer to justice for Carla. Even with the bite mold, however, there was no way to link it to anyone without having some sort of a lead first. The case wasn't put away, but it wasn't front and center over the following 2 years either, until a witness filed a testimony in which she explained she'd recently met a man named John Pronte. Apparently, he'd been bragging about the bite mark on Carla's body. Keep in mind that at this time, the bite mark had not been publicly discussed, meaning John had to have been at the scene to have known such a thing. The bite mold finally came in handy, and investigators were able to compare it to John's dental arrangement, finding it was a perfect fit. Although some people and investigators laughed at the idea that a dental mold would suffice as evidence, Luckily, a dental forensic specialist offered their expertise and agreed that the match was perfect, to say the least. The major piece of evidence was combined with other details, and ultimately, the case against John was built. He was found guilty and sentenced to 75 years in prison. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.